Welcome to the Watershed podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Watershed is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Watershed and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It is my great pleasure to welcome Paul Redvers Brown to the Watershed podcast. Paul is president of Paul Redvers Brown Incorporated, where he helps public agencies and utilities achieve their water management goals through structured planning, communications, and stakeholder engagement. And I'll say real quickly that I had the great pleasure of meeting Paul in action, where he did just this for a bunch of public agencies, my own included. Paul is a fellow of the International Water Association, a member of the Urban Water Institute's board of directors, and previously served on the boards of Jenks Consultants, the International Society of Sustainability Professionals, and the Council for Watershed Health. Prior to forming his own consulting firm, Paul worked for 37 years at CDM Smith, including as executive vice president and board member. His experience at CDM Smith, and on a truly groundbreaking water project in Scottsdale, Arizona, is the subject of his unique, trailblazing, and entertaining book, Too Good to Be True, Scottsdale and Privatization in the 1980s, self-published in 2020. Paul, I am thrilled to speak with you today about your book.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I want to start with really just how you came to write this book, Too Good to Be True. And I'm also interested in, who do you consider to be its intended audience, or who do you most want to read your book?
Well, that's a good question. I'll start with the first half of it. And I had thought about this story for a long time. After I left CDM Smith, a number of years passed, and I was distant enough from the actual events that I really thought I should organize and write something up about what actually occurred. At the same time, I was getting asked to speak to groups of young professionals, about how I had succeeded in a big engineering firm as a non-engineer. My background was English literature. I got an MBA, and I'm now a certified planner. But originally, I started as a technical editor at CDM Smith, and here I was, having kind of climbed the ladder in that organization. How did that happen? In those workshop kind of settings where people are asking me these kind of questions, I found myself telling this complicated story that would ultimately have a lot of the audience cringing, because it was such a horrible story. It's like this is the path to success. This colossal failure was your path to success. That's how you did it. And I realized, gee, there's no short version of this that sounds right. So I was really motivated to really tell the whole story. And that ended up being a book. And if it has an audience, it is probably those young professionals who have told me that it kind of uncovers some of the inside operations of a large engineering firm. I actually, and I don't know if I can prove this, but I actually feel like for a number of young women engineers, this is like a window into the old boys club that most of these large engineering firms were back in the 70s and 80s. And And so there's very few women in this story. But for my wife, this would be she's not the only woman in the story, but she's the most important one. And so it is a kind of look back at this culture that was the Reagan era. It's kind of fascinating in one sense because it has a lot of similarities to what's happening around us today in terms of sort of the shifting cultural environment or context within which things are happening. But those were literally the greed is good days. And I really wanted to tell this story as completely as I could.
Fascinating. And as a fellow English major in the water world, I appreciate. It feels like we almost start a union. It might be just you and me, but also you can appreciate that a story of a fantastic failure sounds very like literature, right? And I kept thinking when I was reading the book, and that's actually a question I wanted to ask, is how you would relate your book, to other books. Were there books that inspired you to write or inspired how you wrote Too Good to Be True? But again, as an English major to an English major, do you see your book almost fitting into a particular genre of writing? Obviously it's an autobiography memoir, but it's also kind of a morality tale or even a national fable from the east to the west coast. I probably won't take to a heroic quest, but it certainly had those elements to it. So I was wondering, what genre would you place this in? But also, were there other books that you were thinking about while you were writing?
The book that that influenced me the most was Barbarians at the Gate.
Excellent.
Which is Brian Burrow and Hellier. And it was the tone of that book. And it was and I don't know if you remember that book. I'm sure you remember it, but the book was really very focused on the people, and yet it never skimped on the details of a really, really complicated series of financial transactions and describing what a leveraged buyout was. So it never shrunk from the technical financial details of the story, but it was really about who were these people and what was driving them, and that was the combination that I really appreciated. And I've since then, I'd say that the writer who to me does this probably as well as anyone, maybe better than anyone, is Michael Lewis, and to me, he's also a kind of role model for how can you tell a complicated story about history and technology and really keep it focused on who are the people in the story and why are they doing what they're doing and what are the conflicts and struggles that they're having. So, whether you're talking about Moneyball or Liar's Poker or The Big Short, these never flinched from getting into the details of what these stories were about, while the humans were the main characters, not the institutions. So those are the books that and authors that I'm the most influenced by. I would say one other thing. This book won an award, and the category it was put in was creative nonfiction.
Right.
And
right.
So a lot of people, I would say, I won this award in creative. Well, for many people, this would sound like an oxymoron, right? It's like, what is creative nonfiction? Other people would call it narrative nonfiction. But there is, I should have mentioned Ken Burns maybe, because I think that he's spoken to this issue relative to the documentaries he makes, which he would describe as sort of 60+% research on the facts, what really happened, and 40% storytelling. Like, what is the story? And anytime we're dealing with these real world situations, there's 1,000 versions of the story. Somebody's got to tell us, someone's got to find the story in the book. And I would say it took me a while writing this before I really found the story. So for me, it's a kind of therapeutic exercise of, I'm at the end of this going to understand it a lot better than I did for the last 25 years.
Yep. You write to understand what you're writing about in many ways. Yeah. And creative nonfiction is an incredibly important genre. My wife writes books that often get categorized that way as well. It's fascinating. So let's get into the book itself and the content. I think my first question would be, what would you say is your central argument, or even the thesis of Too Good to Be True? Is there a point that you came to, or that you finally understood as in writing the book, or that you want to get across?
It's an interesting. That's a very English teacher question.
I know,
because it has to do with, did you have a thesis statement? I didn't, except I did feel like I want to tell the truth about what happened, and I want to tell the truth about what I did to make it happen, for better or worse. And but I did come out of it with a sense of what I think that the thesis really came to me when the chairman of our, ultimately the chairman of our board, Tom Furman, gave me a copy of Rudyard Kipling's poem "If," and talked about how triumph and disaster are both imposters, and that you learn from not just your successes, but failures. I came to the belief that I would never have been, I would never have been as satisfied in my life if I hadn't gone through a horrible experience. I had a great experience and a horrible experience, and they're both in this same book. And he was right that it's better. And you could go to Teddy Roosevelt on this too, the man in the arena. It's better to be on the field playing the game than sitting in the stands cussing at the players. And whether you win or lose, and that's where you belong. And I felt like it was a good story for the kind of brilliant young professionals that we have in our industry who, for the most part, they're A+ students. And when you're in an academic environment, you can take a test and you can get an A, and you can be successful all the time and be horribly disappointed if you get a B-. But you can't take that approach into the real world and be anything other than just an observer of other people's mistakes. You need to make some yourself, because taking chances is the only way to do something different, or be successful in a way that is innovative and different from the status quo. And we certainly need more innovation, and and thinking about the new rules that we have to play by, and I was hoping that that the story itself sort of inspires this idea that it's okay to fail.
That's fascinating. One of your predecessors on the podcast, I interviewed Buzz Thompson for his recent book called Liquid Asset, which is about the private sector in the public water system, in the public water, in public water. And it seems like and what he specifically says is there is a need for more innovation. And that's what the private sector can bring in. And yet your story is about, they can bring in, but there's not a guarantee for success. It's all about what happens at the end. Whomever, public, private sector, whomever gets involved, you have to, in the end, finish with a successful project. It's almost like your story is a deep dive into a very, very important conversation. Speaking of that, your book depicts the private side of public water, specifically the privatization movement of the 80s that probably has developed into what we would probably call today the public-private partnership area of focus. How does your book help us understand the appropriate involvement of private enterprise in the provision of public water services? How does the private and the public interact in the public water system? Obviously, in your experience, but even more generally.
Well, I'd preface this by saying that there really is no civil engineering project out there that doesn't bring together both public and private interests, right? Whether there was a traditional approach to it, which was a sort of the traditional approach was that the client, the public sector, would either internally, and in large agencies, this could be internal engineers, but more often than not, these would be private companies that would be advising the client as to the public sector client what they should do, and then put out a legal document, plans and specs, ask for prices, and a private sector company would build it. And if you were lucky, you would get what you were hoping for. And that traditional approach was less of a partnership than a client and a customer, a public agency and a service company of one kind or another. I think what we've seen since then is just the creation of different bundles of private services that meet the objectives of public sector clients or interests. And I think that they can all work if it's a partnership. I think this issue of privatization differs a lot. The United States is one market. The rest of the world is many other different markets, and the delegation of authority and decision making from the public sector to the private sector happens at very different scales depending on where you are. I think in the U.S. We've done a good job of figuring out how to share risk, how to not be adversarial in the way we're trying to get things done, to get a strong believer in design build projects, progressive design build projects, and these many ways in which you can do design build related projects. Alternative delivery is another name we would use maybe more often today, that fit the needs of the individual customer, client, public sector agency. I don't know that that's really true in the rest of the world. I think that and I'm not equipped to even speak to all of the differences. But I think in the U.S. we've got a nice balance now that doesn't involve private sector interests taking over 100% of the decision-making power and responsibility for managing water resources.
Fascinating. I want to ask a question about the writing of the book itself, and in particular, one of my favorite attributes of the book, which is I was just fascinated in reading it, is the way you present so many what I would call vignettes of experience, the people, the places, the immediate experience of each, down to the meals and even sometimes what you're eating. Is the purpose of this descriptive element or detail is to place the reader in the moment of the action, or is there something else going on? Also just on the practical level, what was your note-taking process in order to preserve all these details, or do you just have an amazing memory for that?
That's a complicated question, and I should probably apologize because there was plenty of critics of the book who pointed out that it is really not necessary for you to give me the recipe for your grandmother's zabaione. That's just
I love this. I loved it.
But it was like, why is this here? And it's a good point. I would say I was probably more self-indulgent in this book than I should have been, but I had all this information. Now, I had always in my professional career kept a very good notes of what I did every day. And in fact, I would purposely put in some little fact about that was unique to the day. If I had a bologna sandwich and I wouldn't normally have one, it was like bologna. That was a bologna sandwich day. Just because when an auditor comes in and it's going through your timesheets and you're charging this many dollars to that project for this task, and maybe I have the task in there, and then they would say, well, what exactly were you doing that day? I would have a very hard time remembering it, but if I remembered the bologna sandwich, I could probably come up with what I was doing on that project that day. Now, did anyone ever really ask me that level of, in audits, did they ever get down to that? No. But I got comfortable just having enough diary so that I could really remember the day and not just have, 6 hours, charge it to just, that wouldn't be enough for me. So yes, I had really good diaries of this whole period of time. And then I had really I had expense reports. I had all my records that I was required to keep. I can now shred them because I've used them to their, I've pretty much finished using them. But and I am obsessed with places. My job kept me on the road. I think when I stopped traveling constantly, I had racked up 5 million miles on American, and that wasn't and that wasn't the airline I even used the most.
Wow.
But
do they let you fly the plane after that? After 5 million miles? No. Okay.
No, they don't, and that's not high enough to get to the concierge levels. So
wow.
I fell short of what I what I might have been able to accomplish. But I just really have always appreciated how different and unique all these places are. And I especially, and we can probably talk about this more, but just having grown up on the East Coast, I was just completely taken with the American Southwest. So all these places that I went to were just inspiring to me. I was just sort of overwhelmed by the American West and the places that it offers. And I was trying to the best of my ability to evoke those memories and be as rich in detail as I could be to make myself feel it again and make it real again, and hopefully draw in readers to the degree that it felt real to them as well.
I wanted to ask you about that. The places aspect of the book really, and it may be just because we have some interesting, almost uncanny overlaps. In that we were both from the East Coast. Me from Connecticut. Your career beginning in Boston, and then moving out west. I live in California now. And also both English majors, obviously. So there's a certain almost literary resonance to the places we've been, and I think that comes across eloquently in your book. Tell us more about maybe the tension between those two different places, or how they interrelate between the East, kind of the more historic Northeast. And I notice Emerson is one of your references in your bibliography.
One of my favorite writers.
Huh? Yes, right. And then as you were just now describing almost the boomtown mythos of the West that you discovered and that you work so closely in.
Well, I tried in this book to set up that tension constantly, and I explicitly tried to create it in two people, Howie Keim and Sumner Kaufman. So Howie Keim, the Western developer, and Sumner Kaufman, the Boston investment banker, are constantly going at it in the course of this story, and I explicitly call this out as being sort of the history of Western expansion and the need for New England Northeastern capitalists, with railroads being sort of the first infrastructure investments that were enablers for Western expansion, and the money coming from one coast and the ideas and entrepreneurship coming from the other. So this, I felt like that tension you're describing goes through the book the whole time. In fact, I was always I loved Howie Keim's office because it was in an authentic rancho building, and I just loved his boardroom with the wood ceilings, and I think I in the book make this observation that when we ended up in downtown Phoenix at this law firm that was doing the work for the financing, that suddenly there was sort of we shifted places, and my suit and tie looked a lot more appropriate for that high-rise office building than Howie's boots. And it had always been the other way around when we were in his office. And so this tension between East and West and the sort of preppy, pain in the ass from Boston, I'm talking about myself, and this just absolutely engaging developer who was originally from Pennsylvania, who and the mayor, Drinkwater, Scottsdale's mayor Drinkwater, who were great friends. This totally fascinated me then, and I hope that comes through in the book.
It absolutely does, and you're able to use these very real characters to really kind of tell us a story about the country in I think a very distinct way, and I would even say a very literary way. Your book also centers on an infrastructure project, and which is I think one of the most unique and fascinating aspects of it. And it also talks about what that project can tell us more generally about our nation's development. I was wondering, do you believe that the lessons that you learned and that you write about in your book on working on this project and more generally working at CDM Smith and also your work, your ongoing work, can that be applied to upcoming large-scale infrastructure projects in the 2020s that we're in now and even beyond? And I can't help thinking about our local large-scale infrastructure projects here in California, but obviously there's projects going on all over the place. But here we have a Delta conveyance project to put a tunnel underneath the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta, a large reservoir project, a Sites Reservoir offstream that is attempting to be put into the ground. The large-scale advanced treatment of wastewater, recycled water, or what we call pure water projects in Southern California. Obviously, very large desalination efforts trying to get off the ground. Do you see your experience in the 80s, as you describe it here, being applicable in the 2020s and beyond?
This question sort of stops me in my tracks in one respect. This Scottsdale plant was a component part of the Central Arizona project, right? So it's what enabled Scottsdale to actually utilize water that was arriving from the Central Arizona project aqueduct. And that project took decades to finally get built, with a lot of opposition in the early years from California and elsewhere, but mostly California. I think today, large-scale projects like the Central Arizona project, because I would say the water treatment plant is a very small-scale thing in the context of the projects you name and the Central Arizona project. They're going to be harder and harder to get comfortable implementing. And I say this because they often prevail because of the economies of scale that large-scale infrastructure offers. But it only offers economies of scale if they're fully utilized. In other words, the economies of scale are this big thing running at its capacity. And we often build a lot of excess capacity in it up front with the promise that full capacity will eventually be reached. And just as a planner, our ability to look out on a 50-year planning horizon, and we're building infrastructure that's meant to last between 50 and 100 years, it's pretty hard to know whether that excess capacity we build in there to achieve the economies of scale those demands are actually going to show up, because it's very hard, I think, in this climate challenged world to predict what the population is going to be, to predict what per capita demands are going to be, to predict whether there's any agricultural demand or not, because of these radical and dramatic changes we're seeing. So what I think is that that projects more like the scale of the treatment plant, not the aqueduct, are going to look better. A more distributed, maybe less centralized system will have the capacity to adapt. Because once we build one big thing based on its economies of scale, if those demands don't show up, there isn't much you can do with that thing. It doesn't have adaptive capacity in it. When we build small modular things on a site on land where there's adequate space to expand a small modular thing, we actually have adaptive capacity. We can stick with what we've got, or we can make it bigger. I think that it's just going to get harder. Let's say it a different way. These big projects are going to be effectively much more expensive and risky than they have been in the last 100 years.
I think you're absolutely right. This is an ongoing and very involved conversation, as you know. That's fascinating. I wanted to ask you, going back to you mentioned two very important characters, and there's many characters in people that you talk about in the book, and I couldn't help thinking, and they're all talked about in very human and very very honest and I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but just they were very real, because they are very real. But you captured the reality, I think, in a very strong way, narratively wise. Did you ever receive any concerns from any of those folks about how they were depicted in Too Good to Be True? Or did you ever, even with the project that you talked about, the water treatment plant, did you ever receive any concerns about how the project was depicted in your book? Just curious. And don't speak about anything you don't feel comfortable speaking about. Obviously.
Well, the only person who had a concern was me. In other words, I was concerned, and Pat Gallagher, a major character, and also my best friend, and still is. He told me, well, if everything you say is true, you don't need to be worried. I said, but I am worried, because I really don't want to hurt people's feelings. And I did, but I showed the book to everyone I could find, who I could find, and who was alive. In draft. And I basically said, look, if you're uncomfortable with anything I have in here, I'll modify it. God knows I could have taken out a lot of stuff in that book and nobody would have missed it. So I always felt like if there was something in there that really bothered somebody, I would remove it. Nobody ever told me, nobody ever told me they were bothered by anything that they read, and I gave it to, I gave it to Howie, I gave it to Sumner. I mean, they both thought it was great, and I think I depicted them as honestly as I could. Most importantly, I tried to depict myself as honestly as I could. I felt like if I could be as hard on myself, or harder on myself than I was on everybody else, that what would be your grounds for complaint? And I never had any, so no, it wasn't a problem.
Well, I think that's a testament to how well you drew others as well as yourself, and that's such an important aspect of the book, is understanding motivations and real human motivations in working on in the environment and on the project that you so expertly describe. You mentioned sharing drafts of the book, and I was actually kind of curious to ask you about the book itself, because I was very impressed when I realized that your book, it has beautiful cover and illustration, the typeface, everything. You self-published this book. And so I was wondering, how difficult, or is it difficult, to publish a high-quality book like this on your own? What was the experience like in actually putting this book together and getting it out there?
I had I loved it. But I came to this with a lot of experience in communications and publications, because I had been working, and you know this world too. I mean, I had been putting together proposals and that kept getting more and more flashy and more color and higher production values. So I really had a very good sense of how to produce a publication. Now, I also I got to give credit to Guy Kawasaki. I don't know if you remember Guy Kawasaki, but he was the Apple chief evangelist.
Oh.
And he published a book called APE. And APE stands for author, publisher, entrepreneur. And I consider myself to be all those things. But his point was back then, I got the book because I was on a panel, I think at UC San Diego, and he was on a different panel, but we were both at the same event. He was fantastic. So there's so many tools out there that if, and I wrote the book on Scrivener, which is a fantastic platform for writing a book and building a book, which I can talk about ad nauseum, the building of a book. And then I would output that to Microsoft with the final page proofs being created by a program called Vellum. And Vellum is a tightly controlled, it's going to give you all kinds of choices, but you will have a beautiful book that it won't let you do anything other than that. And Canva is now from a graphic standpoint, a company that Guy Kawasaki was part of the creation of. I think that the tools, I consider my company a publishing company. I'm an author and I publish books. And I just can't wait for them. I mean, when I say can't wait, I don't have time to go through the ordeal of trying to have a real publisher.
Yep.
And so I'd like to get these books out rapidly, and so I do it myself.
Fascinating. Very cool. Well, I want to talk about your other books in just a second, but just kind of stepping back from the Too Good to Be True, I was actually curious. Now, when you completed the book, I was wondering if you saw the book, or if you see the book now that it's been out for a little bit. Do you see it in dialogue with any other books that are out there, either reinforcing or challenging each other's arguments? How does Too Good to Be True fit within what you would see as the literature of this moment on water, or on any of the topics covered?
I think it's ancient history. I think it is so of a time that is so far back that I think it's got very little. I think it's got very little relevance to the world we're in right now, to be honest. I mean, from the standpoint of the technical content of the book, water treatment plant is still a water. I don't shrink away from describing what a water treatment plant is and what it does and why it works. But I think that the story is more about young, what it's like to be a young professional at a time of extreme change, because that Reagan era had the same kinds of disruptions on a much more modest scale than we're experiencing now. But how you fit into that, and what you, as a young professional, what do you get swept up in, and when are you fooling yourself? When are you doing good things, and when are you just making yourself feel good? Which is two different things. And so I think the story of trying to navigate a very uncertain political, financial, this also had a financial dimension to it, right? I mean, the whole project was driven by very high interest rates on public debt at the time, and our ability, which we were able to actually deliver was tremendous savings on the interest that the city had to pay because of the industrial development bonds that we were able to issue. And we brought equity for tax that were used for tax benefits. This all got done, and it was really an attempt to adapt to the circumstances that existed at that time. How you adapt and how people innovate and how you work together with others to accomplish things that you could never accomplish on your own. That story is as relevant today as ever.
Hear, hear. And as you said, we are now in a rapidly changing environment, and how young people, coming into their industry, surf those changes. This story speaks so directly to that. So I think there's going to be a lot of folks interested in interested in this, what you call ancient history. Do you know how the book was received in the industry, or have you heard from other folks?
I was very well received.
Yeah.
But I don't really market it much. I don't really want to spend a lot of money on marketing per se. I'd rather it was just write another book. This is pretty mod. I mean, it's basically sold about 1,000 copies, which is pretty modest, I would say. It's no bestseller, let's put it that way. But I have always gotten very positive feedback from the people who've gotten through it. So this is, I heard this, you've probably heard this said as well, is that, people don't hate books, although I have encountered people who hate this book. But they stop reading them, like they put them down and they never pick them up again. If you get through this book, you probably liked it. And for most of the people I hear from, they really liked it, and said it just that way. Like, I'm kind of surprised, but I really liked it. But it's a long book. One of the people who's in the book, who I asked to read it, said, okay, but my limit is 250 pages. So I don't read books that are longer than that. And I think this is quite a bit longer than that.
Just a little bit beyond that, 286.
Yeah, so he just made it. He toughed it out and read it to the end. But you have to be, it's too long a book for a lot of people, and I don't. That's fine with me. But I'd rather tell the story I want to tell and take as many pages. It's not what an editor in a real publishing house would allow someone to do, right? Is to overwrite a book to the point that we can't sell this thing. And in fact, it's too expensive to ship. So, I just love writing books.
Well, that comes through with this book, which I couldn't put down, and I enjoyed it all the way through. So I strongly recommend those listening. If you do not have you're not one of the 1,000 people out there who has this book. We need to sell another 1,000 copies. I want to finish just by asking you real quickly about your other books. As you mentioned, you write other books. You mentioned in your biography a co-authored book published by John Wisely and Sons back in 2010, Water-Centric Sustainability Communities, Planning, Retrofitting, and Building the Next Urban Environment, which is about designing the water-centric cities of the future. In our conversation just before recording, you mentioned you're writing a book right now on the metropolitan water districts. So, I'm curious to know on the water-centric book how we've been doing over the past decade and a half since you wrote that book in building a water-centric city. But I'm very interested in also hearing about your other books that you're writing, including the one about Metropolitan Water District.
So on the water-centric sustainable communities book, there is this came out of a efforts that started at about 2006 within IWA, International Water Association, a program called Cities of the Future. And I co-chaired that process. And I worked with Vladimir Novotny, Professor Vladimir Novotny, who, as far as I'm concerned, in that book, he authored it and I wrote some chapters, right? So that is a solid textbook that came out of, and he tells actually, he tells a lot about this whole Cities of the Future effort. And what I would say is, kind of looking at this global picture, is that this idea of water-centric cities, it is very well received in Australia, in China, and in large parts of Europe. And I would say in the in our North American Southwest, but I think we would be talking more about one water than water-centric cities. But this concept of integrated approaches to water management, more decentralized approaches, or we would also say more distributed approaches, maybe in the U.S. This is happening organically in areas that are receptive to it. It has to compete with old models of big centralized systems provided by big companies who effectively are privatizing whatever the service is, if it's wastewater or water, or they're building large facilities to do these things. I'm on a panel tomorrow that is originating in Bombay. I'll be doing it from here, but it's on distributed systems. This is the Bombay Institute of Technology in Mumbai. Looking at this question of distributed wastewater systems that are in fact more resilient and especially in the face of large centralized facilities that are just mostly unused. I mean, they're treating fractions of the design flows that they were meant to treat. And so there's no economies of scale there. There's incredible diseconomies of scale. And so I think this is, cities are organic, really. I mean, they're not designed things. There's a lot of designed components in them. But to the extent that these different approaches are evolving in various places around the world, they still compete with the traditional sort of big infrastructure Western solutions that we like to impose on other countries in the world, especially in the southern hemisphere. But I'm very hopeful that these changes will continue to bubble up from the bottom, bubble up from communities that want to do something different, as opposed to ministers of the environment who want to tell us all what to do.
Exactly. Well, I know they're going to greatly appreciate your participation tomorrow, and as you can tell, and with my laughter or even giggling, I've really enjoyed our conversation, Paul. I've just a tremendous joy to talk to you about your tremendous book, Too Good to Be True: Scottsdale and Privatization in the 1980s. It is self-published in 2020. It is available wherever you find books. I strongly urge any listener who does not have this book on their water shelf to go and get it, and as well as any other book that Paul is putting out there. Paul, thank you so much for appearing on the Water Shelf podcast, and I really enjoyed our conversation.
So did I.
All right, take care. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Watershelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.